All right, everybody, play it forward. Kiersten Villanueva, filmmaker, writer, director. We're going to be talking about Buzzcut. Kiersten, thank you for being here.
Hello, yeah. I'm Kiersten Villanueva. I am a writer, director, producer, and my recent film Buzzcut is what we'll be talking about today. And so to set it up, it is about during a student march to rename a middle school after Filipino labor leaders, a immigrant teen walks into a barbershop and asks for a buzz cut. And what's very special about the story is how it really is about recognizing our roots as Filipino Americans in this country, their legacy that they left behind for us, but then also how we as people can come together and recognize that it's time to stand up for our community, to be activated, and to be there for each other. And so, simply put, it is a story about building connections, friendships, and then also on the larger scope, being a part of a community that's bigger than our own.
Kiersten, awesome. Thank you. So yeah, before we just dive into the themes, of acceptance, identity, belonging that are really strong in the movie, it's very much an American story, no matter, what ethnicity you're coming from. Um, Ultimately that's what is uniting all of us here in this immigrant pool. And the story itself is there's a young kid. He's an immigrant kid. It's not clear if he's Filipino or Asian or even Mexican American or where, but looks, some Asian there, and that he walks into a barbershop where there's another immigrant who owns a barbershop. He's just saying goodbye to what seems to be Mexican American leaving. And Mexican Americans like kind of like what's going on with all these people protesting, and there's some protest, and this guy rushes in, and that sets it up. And it seems like, um, and the film has a pre-log that prelude little, text that talks about the unrecognized um, people who have led protests that have created change or have worked for change. So the change agents. So this kid seemingly is not accepted. He's running into a place of safety and taking some refuge, and it happens to be a barbershop, and he decides to pay this guy to get a buzz cut. And he has long hair, and he gets his hair cut. And in the process, they get to know one another a little bit, and they sympathize around this shared issue of knowing what it feels like to be excluded, and then seeing one another for who they are. So, where did this story come out of your own experience?
I can answer that, but quickly, do you hear the lawnmower? Because I'm really close to the window.
No,
Do you not hear it?
I
Okay.
don't hear it.
Okay, good. I'm just gonna
Thank
close it
you.
really quick. It might bother
All
me.
right, don't worry about it.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you set up the question one more time, please?
Yeah, where did the story come out of your own experience?
Yeah, well, the march was a real thing that happened. I was in high school. It was 2014. I was a senior, and I just remember a bunch of students, primarily Filipino, but it also involved other members of the community from different backgrounds, and they all marched in the name of recognizing Filipino labor leaders, Larry Itliong and Filibert Cruz, who were a crucial part of the farm labor's movement back in the 60s with Cesar Chavez, which a lot of people know about, but not so much the Filipinos who were well a part of that whole movement. And so this at the time was a thing where I wrote a lot of myself into Edward the barber in that he seeing this didn't really feel like it was something to be a part of. Like what's this for? For me, I can say that I didn't recognize its potential and the power that the march had. And I didn't participate. I mean, I didn't put it down, but I also didn't really have any strong feelings about joining that and what that actually meant for the community. And that whole march was just to rename our middle school, which again, like for me, it just didn't sound like, well, what's the big deal? And of course, I would later learn the importance of how they successfully renamed that and were able to really broaden the scope of understanding of Filipino American contribution to the US. And so, in learning that and in hindsight, realize that, wow, this was a very special thing because the renaming of that middle school is the first school in the US to be named after Filipino Americans. So, the fact that it happened in my hometown was incredibly special. And in writing Buzzcut, it was my way of paying it back and just honoring what that meant and how, especially, it could be at any age, now or later, it is always important to be a part of something that's larger than yourself and to be there for the community. And so that was the genesis of the film.
So, like, so it happened and it really happened kind of on your hometown turf. And then there's the thing that made you identify with it enough to say, okay, this is something that I am going to dedicate myself to. This is something that had to touch your heart in some way. So what is it that connected with you in terms of these themes that we're exploring, of identity, of acceptance, of standing up and claiming your identity and getting the recognition for it that in your history made you, connect with this project.
Yeah, I feel like part of my whole filmmaking journey is taking all the steps to honor those that came before me, and also just discovering my voice within that lens has been very beneficial for just learning more about who I am as a filmmaker and also just the type of community that I want to be a part of. The student marchers, they were just in high school, like I said. The amount of energy, the passion, those are the driving forces of what makes me wanting to tell stories. And the fact that I had this thing happen in my hometown was such a big deal to me. And of course, it was only after the fact that I'm like, oh, wow, this thing that happened, this very special thing, I didn't recognize what it meant, but now I do. And so that's been a part of my whole journey. And like I said, putting parts of myself into Edward is just this vulnerability of knowing that I wasn't really present, nor was I uh, considerate of what it meant for other immigrants who had come to this country because I'm Filipino American. I grew up in the Bay Area. I just only known that as my identity. But for those from the Philippines that came over, they lived a very different experience. And so I recall in elementary, middle school, knowing other kids who looked just like me, but they had a thick accent and they got bullied all the time. And I recall one particular friend who I only known for 1 year. And I think after that, he joined a gang, stopped coming to school, and I never saw that kid again. But as I was writing Buzzcut, I was so like, as I was writing Buzzcut, I was remembering what that friendship had meant. And again, it was so short, but he was the base for the character of Nick, and that's the teen who gets the buzz cut. And the reason why I chose a buzz cut is because to me, that also signifies starting over. It could signify, shedding away well, the initial is shedding away your identity. This kid hates his Filipino identity, but as over the course of the story, Edward, as he comes to the realization of his role in the community and realizing, oh, I'm not an active voice. I am only thinking about myself as he gets to know Nick and as he gets to step into what it means to be a part of the community, he reminds Nick, don't look at the buzz cut as a way of shedding yourself. Maybe it's a way of starting over. And that's a part of kind of the phoenix rising from the ashes to be very dramatic,
Yeah,
just
no.
coming out of that into coming into form and coming together with your fellow community members.
And that's awesome. And I think we all, go through this totally human experience of, um, even the bullies, right? They have that same desire to identify with a group, and that's why they're identifying with the bullies group, right? They are looking for that validation and they're seeking that power, through that means. And you're talking about a real empowerment where you're accepting yourself as you are inside and going through um the awful feeling of rejecting who you are. I mean, there's nothing worse than being in a place where you're, rejecting who you are. And that's why it's so important to validate who you are and voice who you are. And I love how you call them marchers because, instead of protesters, instead of injecting, more anger into a conversation, there's just presence, right? The marchers are here and they're asking for something and they're showing solidarity and um, in this request or desire. Now the line, it's so, you know, there's the healthy line of like validating yourself and others and, coming together as who we are in, our physical respective forms, which have histories and cultures and, all those things. But you strip all of those forms away, there's still those formless elements which can't be categorized, but are shared between all of us. So that kind of a conversation, if there wasn't any bullying, there would not be a need to say, oh, well, I'm Filipino and I'm proud. I'm, Jewish, I'm black, I'm whatever, Muslim, Hindu, etc. So if there wasn't that, there wouldn't be this need to do that. So since there is, and 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 our work, I feel with this show and with our is to go beyond that, is to heal that, is to create inclusion where there can be those generations where that's no longer even a sticking point. It's like, oh, of course you're this, of course, yeah, that's just as awesome as anything else. Um, how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for focusing on like what is the catalyst for why we do what we do. And I think the unification that you said, I think that comes from a radicalizing moment. And so let's take Nick, for example. He had gotten beaten up. Of course, that's something that happened moments before our film begins. But think about he is someone who has been in the US for 2 months and it has just been a nonstop thing. This is the only world that he knows. And think on that on a larger scale for people who are harassed for anything, whether it's religion, orientation, the color of their skin. And all of that contributes to this certain angering feeling. But then how do we bridge the divide? And I think obviously through our art, but also just through community, through mutual aid. That's partially why it was important that the film focused heavily on the marchers in the beginning, just to really show that there is a driving force here of people, and it's all in the name of recognition. And I think that's what it takes sometimes, just knowing that you're seen. It makes a person feel less on the sidelines and more we can all equally share the light. And I think part of the journey with Buzzcut and certainly with like my work in general is telling stories about the people who are under a form of oppression and to find ways to get out of that. And, I don't think there's really one single answer. For everyone, it's going to be a different thing, but it is through that moment where, wow, I went through this incredibly tough challenge. How do I overcome that? And I think people are only asking themselves that if they go through a moment that is so deeply personal to them. And that's why I made Buzzcut because at the time when I was writing it, I really had to look within. And also, there were so many social movements that were happening, BLM and all these other important factors for our communities across the board. And I wanted to look within, well, within our Filipino community, there's certainly a lot of things, but to make it on a more smaller level, what happened in my hometown? How can I tell a very personal story? And that student march was a radicalizing moment for a lot of those students. When I was doing research for the film, a lot of those people had gone on to join different organizations that are not just about uplifting Filipinos, but also caring for all community members, whether they're migrants, they're at risk of the working class. Those are all factors of, well, we've gotten a taste of what it's like to put ourselves into something that's beyond us, and we want to continue that. And that's where I see myself in my work and just trying to find ways to tell stories about, the ones that are just brushed off to the sidelines, basically the nicks of society.
What did you call him?
Well, Nick, the character of Buzzcut. So I
Oh,
said the Knicks,
right, right. Yeah,
not the basketball team.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I know I appreciate that. Thank you for that answer. And I think the key that I can really relate to is the idea of going beyond our own, ultimately we confront our identity. It's kind of like this trajectory, right? Very much like the arc of a plot or a narrative. There's
Hmm.
this confrontation of self, which you either accept or you don't. And then um, the continuing maturation of the soul or the spirit accepts that ultimately and continues to mature beyond that. Well, how do you grow beyond the limited identification with the self? Like, and that is through outreach to the other and then bridging that self and other divide in some capacity. So whether it's done through telling stories of the other or serving others in any way, serving others as all of our family, the word community extending to the human community, and animal, mineral, vegetable, ultimately that extension, I think, is what allows us to move beyond our own narrow perspective, which is um, in some way limited or selfish, and then
Hmm.
allows us to see a bigger world and then experience that world. So, yeah, any thought around that?
I mean, I feel like that's part of the journey that we're all under in discovering our voices in film. I don't know if I have an answer. I just know that I'm heading the right direction. And I think a lot of that is through the people I meet along the way. And I just know that it's always an educational process wherever you land. And there's something to take away from any experience. I learned so much from Buzzcut and getting to work with different people from that set, but then also other sets and finding ways and like kind of like puzzle pieces where you're just knowing that, wow, this is someone that is so interesting and so exciting, and I have a lot to learn from them, but also a lot to grow together. It's always a journey where it feels like it's all parallel lines, but obviously at different paces. And that's something that I feel like in finding for my story, for my journey, like what does that exactly look like? And I think a lot of what informs the stories I want to tell, the type of filmmaker, but also just a person beyond that, is simply through just living, simply through putting myself in situations where I get to meet different kinds of people and just to be surrounded by things that aren't just, uh, my inner circle, or I guess my bubble of where I live and where I tend to play in terms of like film and arts and all of that. I think there's so much that we can grant ourselves in, the outside experience, meeting, like I said, other kinds of people and putting ourselves in new kinds of situations. I like to embrace that kind of uncertainty just because I know that I'll come out on the other side having learned something new. And I put in trust and faith in that I am always headed in the direction that I'm meant to go. So this is a very long-winded way of saying like I don't really have an answer, but it is something I very much believe in. Like I just know everyone I've met along the way have made a significant difference in my life, and I know that it'll only continue to be that way as I push along this journey in film.
Awesome. Uh, I think that's a beautiful answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
And what does this film mean to you now?
Yeah, I mean, I made this film in 2023, which, by the way, was through a generous grant from a nonprofit organization called A Bunch of Savages. They're made up of Filipino American creatives. And so that tells you alone how much our own community is investing in itself and how much that We want our stories told. We want our voices, our faces put to the big screen. And the fact that grants like that exist, but also the encouragement from community members within this has been such a special thing to just be a part of. And so I made the buzz cut in 2023, and 2 years later, I still think very fondly of that time. It's the film that I'm proud of the most. I've made several short films, but that's the one that felt that it came the closest to my vision and the type of story. And because I was telling a piece of my hometown's history, it was very important that I was able to tell it as authentically as possible. And I feel like I did that. A large part of also what I look back on is just, like I said, getting to know the people that participated on that production, definitely through the nonprofit, but then also where I took the film to the festival circuits. The people I know now, the people I collaborate with, I've met at film festivals. And so the fact that Buzzcut had taken on its own life in the festival circuit, and it came out the other side with so many great people that I'm waiting to collaborate with and finding ways to like be in their sphere and to grow our sphere collectively. That's what I think about most about Buzzcut.
Kiersten Villanueva, thank you for being on the show, filmmaker, writer, director, producer. The film is Buzz Cut, and Kiersten, come back, keep rocking it, keep stepping into the unknown, and thank you for being
Absolutely.
here today.
Thank you for your time. I enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. All right, everybody, we're out on Play It Forward. Be well later, Kiersten,
Thank you.
and